Angus Taylor, the Energy and Emissions Reduction Minister, is at it again. Last week, after a near 2-year delay, the Minister released the government's electric vehicle strategy. But it got off to a bad start, even from the headline. It's not called an electric vehicle strategy, it's called a future fuel strategy. And that's because it's not really about electric vehicles at all, it's about how not to have electric vehicles in Australia. Angus Taylor wants us to focus on hybrids, not plug-in hybrids, just plain old hybrids, what are called mild hybrids. Think of the Toyota Prius, which was released more than a decade ago, or perhaps some of the hybrid Camrys or RV4s that you see quite often around the streets in Australia. It's extraordinary because the world is heading in another direction altogether. Norway is actually going to ban all forms of hybrids, both mild and plug-in, from 2025. The UK is doing that in 2030. Europe is expected to follow. Even the big car manufacturers are saying they're not going to be making any more hybrids after a certain time. General Motors, the giant US monolith, was the latest to come to this conclusion. Why is Taylor doing this? Well, let me try and explain. It seems to me that Angus Taylor is taking the same set against electric vehicles as he did against wind and solar. Before he came into Parliament, he was advocating against wind and solar subsidies and has been doing that ever since. But now that he's actually Minister of Energy and Emissions Reduction, he might be in a position where he can actually stop or slow down the introduction of this new technology. Why? Let's go back to the last election campaign when Angus Taylor and, like many of his coalition colleagues, were sprouting a whole bunch of nonsense about electric vehicles. Remember, it was going to kill the weekend and be the end of the tradies' ute. Well, Taylor added in some of his own little pieces of wisdom, including the fact that it will take a ridiculous amount of time to charge with solar or add extraordinary costs to buildings for charging infrastructure. And this latest discussion paper has a similar amount of nonsense. And this time it's couched in terms of abatements cost, which is the amount you pay to reduce emissions. And Angus Taylor says the subsidies for electric vehicles would be up to $750 a tonne. Now that's an absolute absurd number, and for several reasons. For a start, he's compared apples with oranges. He's used the example of a big electric delivery van with a small petrol one. Well, that's a bad start because that's just dishonest and misleading right from the start. And that's the example he uses for this extraordinary number of $750 a tonne. But if you go deeper into the figures, it shows that he's not actually looking at the transformation of the grid that will take place to renewables. He's only looking a few years out, not 10 or 15 years, which would be the life of an electric vehicle. In fact, an electric vehicle is probably going to last 20 years. He uses some pretty strange costings for the cost of electricity, and he doesn't take into account any of the other factors, such as tailpipe emissions, which cause the deaths of more than 3,000 people in Australia each year, and of course fuel security. Australia has a major problem with refining its own petrol, or its inability to do so, and relying on imports from other Asian countries. Look, hybrids are not a bad thing. For many people, it's the most sensible choice they have at the moment, particularly because we have so few electric vehicles and so few affordable electric vehicles in Australia, partly due to our lack of policy. There are some car makers that refuse to bring their EVs into Australia, such as VW, such as Kia, because there's no support. They're not looking for big subsidies, they're just looking for a plan for the future. And this strategy paper doesn't do that. It doesn't look to the future or even to the present, it's looking to the past. Australia needs to find the technologies to support the transition to zero emissions. The rest of the world is moving to battery electric, that much is clear. Australia has to wake up. It can't continue to be a dumping ground for dirty vehicles that can't be sold elsewhere. But tragically, it seems that Angus Taylor doesn't want that to happen. It seems, alarmingly, that he wants to do to electric vehicles what he failed to do with wind and solar, wants to try and stop them in the tracks. The irony is that if we do have more electric vehicles, the call for wind and solar will grow ever more present, because it would make sense to have a decarbonised grid along to allow a decarbonised transport system. Australia has to seize the opportunity. It can't be left stuck in the past. We can't be choosing the car equivalent of a fax machine over the future of battery technology.